When Tammy Wynette's daughter looked back on her mother's final days, she didn't speak like someone remembering a country legend. She spoke like a daughter remembering a mother she loved, and a woman who had endured more pain than anyone truly knew. Her words peeled back the glamour, the headlines, the stage lights, and revealed a truth that had been quietly hidden for years. Tammy's passing in 1998 stunned the world. To millions, she was the first lady of country music, a voice that defined an era, a symbol of strength who stood by her man. Yet behind closed doors, Tammy was fighting battles that no spotlight ever caught. Her final months weren't spent in the glow of fame, but in a fragile, intimate world where family and health collided in heartbreaking ways. For decades, the full story of those last days remained shrouded in silence. Now, through the eyes of her daughter, a clearer picture is emerging. What really happened in Tammy Wynette's final days, and why did her family keep it quiet for so long? Tammy Wynette's story began far from the glittering stages of Nashville. Born Virginia Wynette Pugh in 1942 in rural Mississippi, she grew up surrounded by the sounds of gospel, hardship, and resilience. Her father, a farmer and musician, died when she was just 8 months old. Her mother went north for work, leaving Tammy to be raised by her grandparents in a modest home where music was both comfort and escape. From those early years, Tammy learned how to survive and how to sing her way through pain. By the time she reached her 20s, she had lived more life than many twice her age. She married young, became a mother of 3, and worked as a hairdresser to keep her family afloat. But the dream of singing never faded. She began performing at small local radio stations and talent contests, pushing past rejection after rejection. Her determination caught the attention of producer Billy Sherrill, who saw something in her that others had overlooked, a raw emotional power that could reach straight into a listener's heart. When Tammy stepped into the recording studio in 1966, her voice carried the weight of every struggle she had endured. It wasn't polished perfection that set her apart. It was the way she could make a lyric sound like lived truth. Her breakthrough came with Apartment Number 9, followed quickly by Your Good Girl's Gonna Go Bad, which catapulted her into the national spotlight. But it was in 1968, with the release of Stand By Your Man, that Tammy became a household name. The song was both celebrated and controversial, yet its emotional honesty struck a chord across America. Success transformed her life, but it also added layers of complexity. The shy young woman from Mississippi suddenly stood at the center of the country music world, performing at the Grand Ole Opry, winning Grammy Awards and appearing on national television. She became the embodiment of a certain kind of strength, a woman who endured, who stood loyal, who sang about heartbreak with a tear in her voice that sounded real because it was. Audiences didn't just listen to Tammy, they felt her. Behind the scenes, the pace was relentless. Touring schedules stretched her to exhaustion, and the demands of fame were unyielding. Yet Tammy rarely showed cracks in public. She maintained a poised image, always elegant, always composed even as personal challenges mounted. She remarried, moved to Nashville permanently, and tried to balance motherhood with an increasingly consuming career. Her daughters often watched from the sidelines as their mother transformed into an icon before their eyes. This period defined the Tammy the world remembers, the performer with the towering hair, the shimmering gowns, the trembling voice that could silence a crowd. But it also set the stage for the pressures that would follow her for the rest of her life. The young woman who once sang to survive was now singing to sustain an empire built on her voice and persona. Every performance deepened her connection with fans, but it also demanded more of her physically and emotionally. By the end of the 1960s, Tammy Wynette wasn't just a star. She was a symbol. Her life looked glamorous from the outside, but the foundation was built on relentless work, personal sacrifice, and a vulnerability she rarely allowed the world to see. Those early triumphs would carry her to unimaginable heights, yet they would also come with a cost that would become more visible in the years ahead. Tammy Wynette's public image often centered on romantic devotion, but her personal life was far more turbulent. Her first marriage to Upal Bird, a construction worker, began when she was still a teenager. It was a union forged out of youthful hope, not stability. Upal struggled to hold steady work, and the couple lived in poverty. Tammy supported the family by working as a hairdresser, raising their children while nurturing her dream of singing. When the marriage unraveled, she left determined to build a different life for herself and her daughters. Her second marriage to Don Chappell seemed more promising at first. Don was a songwriter and performer, and together they appeared to share a love for music, but the relationship quickly soured under the pressures of her rising fame. During this period, she crossed paths with George Jones, the legendary country singer whose voice and troubled spirit mirrored her own. Their chemistry was undeniable. They fell in love, and Tammy divorced Chappell to marry Jones in 1969. The marriage of Tammy Wynette and George Jones became one of country music's most talked about unions. To the public, they were a golden couple, two powerful voices, two emotional storytellers, often performing together, as if their songs were pages from their own love story. On stage they looked inseparable. Offstage the reality was stormier. George battled alcoholism, and their home life often reflected that chaos. Tammy tried to hold their world together while maintaining her career at full speed. Their daughter Georgette was born into a household where fame and instability coexisted. For Tammy's older daughters, this period was transformative. Their mother's fame meant constant movement, late nights, and the unrelenting presence of cameras and fans. Home was wherever Tammy happened to be performing. They lived within the whirlwind of her career, witnessing both the adoration she received and the strain it placed on their family. Tammy loved her children deeply, but her schedule left little space for the ordinary rhythms of family life. The spotlight offered glory, but no privacy. Tammy's marriage to George Jones eventually crumbled under the weight of addiction, financial troubles, and personal clashes. They divorced in 1975, though their professional collaborations and mutual affection lingered for years. Even after their split, audiences held on to the image of Tammy and George as a tragic romantic pair whose songs told a deeper truth. For her children, though, the breakup marked another shift in an already unstable home life. Tammy's resilience allowed her to keep performing, but the emotional cost of her personal relationships was mounting. She would go on to marry 3 more times. Some of these unions were brief, others lasted longer, but none brought lasting peace. Her final marriage to George Ritchie, her longtime manager, was the most enduring. It bound her personal and professional lives together tightly, creating a household where career decisions and family life intertwined constantly. For Tammy's daughters, this dynamic sometimes blurred lines between maternal warmth and business imperatives. Amid these shifting relationships, Tammy's children grew up watching their mother navigate love and heartbreak in both real life and song. They saw her stand before crowds as a figure of strength, even when home life was fragmented. Each marriage brought new hopes, new complications, and new adjustments for the family. Tammy's devotion to her career never wavered, but the sacrifices required to maintain that devotion shaped her children's experiences in lasting ways. By the late 1970s, Tammy Wynette was not just a celebrated artist, but also a woman whose personal story was etched with broken promises, public scrutiny, and private struggles. Her family lived inside that story every day. The glamour of being close to country music royalty came with a quieter price, one paid behind closed doors, away from the microphones and applause. As the 1970s gave way to the 80s, Tammy Wynette's personal battles began shifting from turbulent marriages to something even more consuming: her health. Years of relentless touring, emotional strain, and the physical demands of performing began catching up to her. Behind the curtain, her body was breaking down in ways the public never fully grasped. Tammy underwent her first major health scares in the early 1970s, but by the time she entered her 40s, medical issues had become a constant part of her life. She experienced chronic abdominal pain that baffled doctors for years. Surgeries became routine. She endured repeated procedures to address intestinal problems, gallbladder complications, and scar tissue that formed after each operation. Hospital visits were frequent, sometimes in the middle of concert tours, yet she rarely canceled shows. Even after emerging from surgery, she often returned to the stage sooner than doctors advised, unwilling to let audiences down. The pain never truly subsided. Throughout the 1980s, Tammy relied increasingly on prescription medications to manage her symptoms. Painkillers became a daily part of her life, not out of indulgence but out of necessity. She lived with near-constant discomfort, often performing with a brave smile while suffering privately. Close friends and family members noticed how fragile she had become, though the public still saw the poised star they had always known. Her health struggles extended beyond her abdominal issues. Tammy experienced infections, complications from earlier surgeries, and moments of sudden medical crisis. She was hospitalized numerous times, sometimes in critical condition, yet she consistently returned to work. Her ability to push through pain became part of her legend. She carried herself as if nothing could keep her down, even when her body told a different story. The combination of surgeries, medications, and a demanding lifestyle began to take a visible toll. Her weight fluctuated. Her energy waned. Yet Tammy refused to step away from the spotlight. She continued to record albums, appear on television, and tour internationally. Her commitment to her fans was unwavering, but the cost of that commitment grew heavier each year. Family members saw the toll up close. They witnessed the long hospital stays, the anxious nights, and the moments when Tammy's strength faltered. Her home life became punctuated by medical emergencies. Oxygen tanks and medical equipment became fixtures in her home during her later years. Yet she maintained the same outward grace, rarely letting the public glimpse the reality behind her iconic image. By the early 1990s, Tammy's health had deteriorated to the point where her condition was no longer just a background concern. It dominated her daily existence. Multiple surgeries had left her body weakened, and her dependence on medication was firmly entrenched. She still performed, but her tours required careful planning around her health. She often traveled with nurses or medical staff to ensure she could continue meeting her obligations. Through it all, Tammy remained determined to keep her career alive. The stage had been her refuge since childhood, and she clung to it even as her health unraveled. She saw herself not as a patient, but as a performer with a responsibility to her audience. It was this relentless drive that carried her into the final chapter of her life, even as those closest to her began to fear the inevitable. By the late 1990s, Tammy Wynette was living in a fragile balance between public appearances and private decline. She was still revered as a pillar of country music, and audiences continued to flock to see her. Yet behind the bright lights, her world had grown smaller and more carefully managed. Every appearance required planning, medical support, and immense personal effort. In the months before her passing, Tammy limited her touring schedule, but continued to record and make select appearances. Her final concerts were marked by an almost defiant strength. Fans saw a woman still capable of commanding a stage, though her frame had grown thin and her movements more measured. She often sat while singing, conserving energy, but her voice still carried the same emotional force that had defined her career. Crowds responded with reverence, sensing perhaps that they were witnessing the end of an era. At home in Nashville, Tammy's daily life had become a medical routine. Oxygen tanks were positioned near her favorite chair. Nurses and caregivers came and went. She needed assistance with even simple tasks, but she tried to maintain dignity and independence. She spent long hours surrounded by family, close friends, and the comforts of a home she had built during her years of success. The house, once filled with music, now echoed with the quiet rhythms of care and concern. Despite her condition, Tammy remained involved in her career until the end. She recorded vocals when she could, often between bouts of exhaustion. Her final studio sessions showed flashes of the brilliance that had made her a star, even as her strength waned. Those who worked with her during this period spoke of her determination, her refusal to surrender to frailty, and the way she focused on music as if it were the one constant she could control. Medical challenges intensified in her last year. Chronic pain persisted, and complications from previous surgeries created unpredictable health crises. She endured episodes that left those around her fearing the worst, yet she repeatedly recovered enough to return home. Her resilience became both remarkable and heartbreaking. Each recovery offered hope, but each was shorter than the last. Her husband, George Ritchie, managed much of her care alongside medical professionals. Friends and family visited frequently, offering support while respecting the careful structure that surrounded Tammy's daily life. She valued her privacy deeply. Even as her health declined, she avoided publicizing the severity of her condition. Fans knew she was unwell but did not grasp the extent of her fragility. As spring of 1998 approached, Tammy's strength faded rapidly. She spent most days at home, resting in the company of loved ones. Her presence remained commanding, but her body was no longer able to match her will. Those around her began to sense that her long fight was nearing its end. Conversations grew quieter. Time together felt more precious. There was no grand announcement, no farewell tour, no orchestrated final bow, only the steady rhythm of days marked by care, reflection, and quiet resolve. The world outside saw a legend who had simply slowed down. Inside her home, those closest to her were preparing for a moment they both dreaded and understood. Tammy Wynette's final months were not defined by the spotlight that had followed her for decades, but by the intimacy of family, the presence of those who loved her, and the unspoken knowledge that her extraordinary life was reaching its closing chapter. When Tammy Wynette's daughter spoke about her mother's final days, the image she painted was neither dramatic nor staged. It was deeply personal. She remembered not the star on stage, but the woman sitting at home in her chair, surrounded by quiet, fragile yet determined to keep some sense of normalcy. For her, those last moments were not about fame, but about family, trying to hold on to someone they loved as the inevitable approached. On the evening of April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette passed away at her Nashville home. She was 55 years old. It happened quietly. She was resting in her favorite spot, the living room sofa, where she had spent so many of her final days. There were no reporters outside, no stage lights, no farewell event. Her daughter later reflected on the peacefulness of that moment, contrasting it with the intensity of the life her mother had lived. The end came in the same place Tammy had clung to her privacy, within the walls of her home. In the days leading up to her passing, family members and close friends were by her side. They were accustomed to medical scares, but something felt different this time. Her strength had diminished sharply. Simple conversations carried more weight. There were shared looks between loved ones that didn't need words. Her daughter has described a deep awareness that time was running out, even if no one could say when the final moment would come. It was not a dramatic collapse but a slow fading of energy, as if the fight that had carried her through countless hospital stays had finally eased. Medical professionals had been monitoring Tammy's condition closely. She had experienced years of chronic health complications, including issues with her intestines, gallbladder, and frequent infections. In her final months, she required oxygen at home and was under continuous medical supervision. On that April evening, she was found unresponsive, and it was clear she had slipped away peacefully. Emergency responders confirmed her death shortly after. Her daughter later reflected on how private those final hours were. Tammy had spent decades under the relentless gaze of the public. Her life had been chronicled in songs, tabloids, and television specials. Yet the moment that mattered most happened away from all of that. It was a family moment. There was sadness but also a strange sense of relief that her suffering had ended. The woman who had endured so much pain no longer had to fight. In the immediate aftermath, the family faced a wave of public mourning. News of Tammy Wynette's death spread quickly, shocking fans who hadn't realized just how ill she had been. Her daughter recalled the surreal experience of seeing tributes flood in, while still processing her own grief. For years, Tammy had kept much of her medical struggle private. Now the world wanted answers. Autopsy reports and legal disputes later drew headlines, but those were separate from the quiet reality the family lived that night. Her daughter's recollections revealed a truth that few knew at the time. Tammy's final days were defined not by spectacle, but by stillness. Her life had been loud, passionate, and filled with public emotion. Her death, by contrast, was intimate and calm. It was the kind of ending she might have quietly hoped for, surrounded by those who loved her most, away from the pressures that had shaped so much of her life. Through her daughter's eyes, those last days were not about loss alone. They were also about closure, an end that matched the private woman behind the public legend. News of Tammy Wynette's passing spread quickly across the country music world. Within hours, radio stations dedicated their programming to her songs, and television networks replayed archival footage of her most iconic performances. Fans gathered outside her Nashville home to lay flowers, light candles, and pay respects to the woman whose voice had carried them through decades of heartbreak and hope. For many, her death felt like the end of an era. Tammy had been more than an entertainer. She was a cultural touchstone, and her absence was immediately felt. Her funeral drew a remarkable gathering of family, friends, and fellow performers. The service was held at Nashville's Ryman Auditorium, a venue steeped in country music history. Artists who had shared stages with Tammy stood alongside younger singers who had grown up idolizing her. The mood was reverent and emotional. Mourners spoke not only of her talent but also of her resilience, the way she had endured personal trials while continuing to give everything to her audience. Her daughters were central to the ceremony, honoring their mother not as a distant star but as a woman whose life had shaped their own in profound ways. In the weeks that followed, tributes poured in from across the country. Country music veterans shared personal memories, while fans recounted stories of how Tammy's songs had mirrored their own lives. Radio stations played her classics on repeat. Awards shows and televised specials dedicated segments to her legacy. Her passing reminded the industry of the power she held as the First Lady of Country Music, a title she had earned through decades of vulnerability and emotional truth in song. Amid the public outpouring, the family faced private complexities. Questions arose about the circumstances of her death and her medical treatment in her final years. An autopsy was performed and subsequent legal disputes unfolded over her estate and medical care. These proceedings brought media attention back to the family at a time when they were still grieving. Her daughters, especially, found themselves navigating both personal loss and public scrutiny. It was a challenging balance, mourning their mother while preserving the dignity of her legacy against sensational headlines. Despite the turmoil, Tammy's legacy remained firmly intact. Her music continued to chart posthumously, and re-releases introduced her work to new audiences. Younger generations discovered her through television specials and tribute albums. Her daughters played a key role in maintaining that legacy, granting interviews, participating in commemorative events, and ensuring that the public remembered both the artist and the woman behind the music. Over time, the initial shock gave way to reflection. Tammy Wynette's story was revisited through documentaries, biographies, and retrospective performances. Each portrayal revealed a different facet: the performer who mesmerized audiences, the woman who fought through pain, and the mother whose private life was more complex than many realized. Her daughters continued to speak thoughtfully about her life, offering personal perspectives that deepened public understanding without sensationalizing her struggles. In the years since her passing, Tammy's songs have retained their emotional power. Tracks like Stand By Your Man, Divorce, and Till I Can Make It On My Own remain staples of classic country playlists, their themes as resonant as ever. Her influence is audible in the voices of countless singers who came after her, many of whom cite her as a guiding force in shaping their sound. Through the combined efforts of her family and devoted fans, Tammy Wynette's legacy endured, not as a relic of the past, but as a living thread woven into the fabric of country music history. Tammy Wynette's life was a tapestry of triumph and hardship, woven together by a voice that carried the weight of real experience. She rose from rural Mississippi to redefine country music, navigating fame, family, and relentless health battles with a strength that never wavered in public. Her final days unfolded not under the glare of cameras, but in the quiet of her home, surrounded by the people who had known her not as an icon, but as a mother, a wife, and a woman who had given everything to her craft. Her passing left a space that could never truly be filled, yet her legacy endures in every lyric she sang and every heart her music touched. Through her daughter's recollections, the world glimpsed the private truth behind the legend. A reminder that even the brightest stars live their final chapters in the same quiet human way as anyone else. For more emotional stories, check out this video.